So let's recap last lesson. Why did Khrushchev put missiles into Cuba? Modes.
One reason being to protect Cuba
From
the American CIA.
From an American invasion, all right? And why was that a big thing? Because what had happened previously? The CIA had done what?
They flew over.
No, they attacked, invaded Cuba at the
Bay of Pigs.
Bay of Pigs.
Oh.
Yeah, Bay of Pigs invasion, all right? So that's number one. What's number two? Yeah.
He wanted to decrease the gap in nuclear power.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and how would that help?
Because they didn't have a lot of long-range missiles, so if they put the missiles they did have closer to America, it would even out the power.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the Americans had put Jupiter missiles in which country right next? What kind? Turkey. Yeah,
Sorry.
look at that.
No, it's okay.
No, that's cool.
Sorry.
So that was why they put missiles into Cuba. What was the result? How did it resolve itself? What was the deal that was made? Yeah.
Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba if Kennedy removed his from Turkey, but this wasn't made known to the public, so it kind of looked like Khrushchev just kind of failed pathetically, and Kennedy was such a good guy for stopping the Soviet Union again.
Absolutely. And there was one other promise Kennedy made, not to do what? Not to invade Cuba. Yes, we've got two problems. Not to invade Cuba. That was kind of public, but the one that wasn't public was he would also withdraw his missiles from Greece and Turkey. All right, and as May has rightly said, because the public bit comes out, all right, and which was Khrushchev got rid of his missiles. It was seen as a great victory for Kennedy, and Khrushchev was humiliated. So he was seen as a great triumph. Khrushchev, as we know, sort of like then a couple of years later, he's on holiday in his Dhaka, and is told not to return to Moscow. And eventually will be taken over by a guy called Leonid Brezhnev, who we'll talk more about later. So from this, we're going to transition, look at the end of the Kennedy administration, and he only lasts another year because he's going to get assassinated. And then Lyndon Barnes Johnson, LBJ, will take over. LBJ will keep a lot of JFK's people there. All right, so people like Robert McNamara will stay as Secretary of the State for Defense. Following on from Cuban Missile Crisis, these guys, they see themselves as the best and the brightest, in Daniel Halberstam's words, the best and the brightest. Look, they've been able to use these new ideas of programming and manufacturing and technology to be able to beat the Russians, the Soviets. Wow, they really are fantastic, and they believe their own propaganda, they believe their own ideas, and this is hubris developed, and we see that coming into American policy in Vietnam, all right? Because in 1963, the most consequential assassination will not be that of John F. Kennedy, but will be that of a guy called Ngo Diem, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about Vietnam post-World War II, all right? In fact, I'm going to go back to Vietnam in the Treaty of Versailles, because we've got a Treaty of Versailles. Well, firstly, Vietnam. Vietnam is part of what's called Indochina, imaginatively titled because it's between India and China, so we call it Indochina. All right, and alongside Cambodia and Laos, made up French Indochina. All right, French Indochina was occupied by the French from based around some trading ports, as usual from Europeans, kind of like Goa, Pondicherry, etc. And that then developed into the 19th century with them occupying French Indochina. With them came Christianity, particularly French Catholicism. So what developed in Vietnam and in French Indochina was an elite of locals who were French speaking, tended to be Catholic, and they were in the cities. All right, they were like the local elites that the French used to govern the country, and they were surrounded by predominantly Buddhist peasantry. Okay, so this is one of our splits that there will be. All right, and what you should be thinking about is when we talk about why did the Americans lose in Vietnam, or why were the communists able to win? One of this is this disconnect between the urban French Catholics and the large majority of peasants who were Buddhist. So you have religious and you have urban rural splits, regardless of anything to do with communism or regardless of anything to do with American policy, full stop. Okay. 1919, we've got the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles, a dude appears, knocks at the door. Hello, let me in. My name is Ho Chi Minh, and I represent Vietnam, and I want there to be, you're talking about the liberation, national liberation, and you're talking about self-determination, Mr. Wilson. Well, I would like to say we should have self-determination in Vietnam. And they said, that's very, very nice, but I'm the security guard, please leave. And so that was Ho Chi Minh's first sort of like foray, trying to speak of the League of Nations. He joins he obviously gets expelled, he joins the Communist Party in China, across the border. There's debate about how much he is a communist and how much he is a nationalist. He's certainly both. He's certainly a communist, and he certainly wants Vietnam to be independent. The big change occurs for French power in Vietnam in 1940, because in 1940 the French are defeated by Germany. They're occupied by Germany. All right, northern France is occupied by the Germany, ready to invade England. Southern part and middle of France, known as Vichy France, is basically an allied power to the Germans, to the Nazis in World War II. Question then is what's going to happen to French colonies, and they basically have to choose. Do you go with the Vichy government? All right, because I remember in 1940, like the Germany's pretty much won the war. All right, they just got England to defeat and British Empire to defeat, but like they pretty much won it. Or do you go with the Free French, who's been established under a general called de Gaulle in England, who broadcasts after the French surrender, we will carry on fighting for free France. Which way do you go? And the colonies go 50-50, some go this way, some go that way. French Indochina goes with the Vichy government. All right, so this means that it's because basically they're in the middle of nowhere. And then in 1941, the Japanese go, well, since you're now on our side, for protection, and because you're on our side of the war now, we're going to send troops in. Do you want to fire on these troops, or do you want to let these Japanese troops into Indochina? And the French colonial authorities were like, oh, you come in, we're going to fight you. All right, so the Japanese occupy all of French Indochina. All right, so this period of Japanese occupation. At first, it's kind of a 50-50 alongside supporting the colonial administration. As the war goes on, it's a Japanese occupation. So, Pearl Harbor happens in 1941. So, anybody who's fighting the Japanese, the Americans clearly want to support. Ho Chi Minh, with his communists in the north, they've established what's called the Viet Minh. All right, the Viet Minh group, and the CIA. In those days, it's called the OSS, but it affected the CIA. They start supplying and helping Ho Chi Minh because they want anybody to defeat the French. All right. 1945, Japan, two atomic bombs go off. The Russians join the war. The Americans getting ready to invade Japan. Japan surrenders. In the famous words of the Japanese emperor, first time he ever talks is on radio. The first time anybody's ever heard his voice outside his palace, he talks and he says, the war, this is his exact quote, the war's not necessarily turned out to Japan's advantage. As in, our cities have been flattened, the atomic bombs are going off, the whole world's against us. It's not necessarily gone our way. So Japan surrenders, which means there's suddenly a grasp for occupied territories who's going to take over from the Japanese. France, yes, it's just been liberated, but it's still a bit of a mess, so France really can't do it straight away. So occupation zones, and you know this from Korea, it's going to be split along a parallel, north and south. So in the north, the Chinese nationalists occupy Vietnam, kick out the Japanese, and in the south the British do. Alright? So the British do, and then both sides withdraw and allow the French to come back in. The Second World War in Asia is a massive historic change because it completely undermines the idea of European empires in Asia. Alright, all of them, the British in Singapore and Malaya, Burma, the French in Indochina, the Dutch in Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia, have all been defeated. Their myth of Western European supremacy has been defeated. The war is supposedly about freedom, so it's only a matter of time where these countries start agitating for independence. However, the French are determined that they are going to hang on to Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, particularly Vietnam because that's the richest provinces. So they begin a campaign of war to keep back Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. Alright, so this is the origins of the first Indochina War. And the second Indochina War is what we call Vietnam. Alright, that's when the Americans get involved, but this is the first Indochina War. And it goes along as you much might expect. The French have a lots of fighting that goes on there. The French government is divided. There's lots of splits in France, national splits in France. France is always split in half between left and right. This time is no exception. And it all comes to a head in 1953. In 1953, there's going to be talks in Geneva about what we're going to do with Vietnam. The Chinese are going to be there, the British are going to be there, the Americans are going to be there. Also, one thing I should have said, post-Korea, the Americans start subsidizing the French. So the Americans are involved in Vietnam, but what they are involved in is just basically, this is what, essentially it's a proxy war now. The Americans are paying for the French. 80% of the French money that pays for their colonies in Vietnam is all paid for by the Americans. Their equipment is all American equipment. And in 1953, there's going to be a conference to determine what happens, and so both sides have a idea to make a point about what's going to happen, and beforehand to increase their leverage at the conference, and this will result in a very significant battle called the Dien Phu. Dien Bien Phu is a place right on the border almost between China, Vietnam and Laos, particularly towards the Laos side. It's a French fort, and the North Vietnamese, the Viet Minh, decide to attack the French there. The French decide they're going to stand and fight because they think they can defeat the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh throw everything at the French. The French think it's impossible because it's right up high in the mountains. They can't bring guns or anything like that up here. They can't bring tanks. The Viet Minh disassemble all of their tanks and all their guns and by hand take them up to the top of the mountains, and eventually they defeat the French. Alright, they defeat the French in a fixed battle, which is supposedly a Western superiority. They defeat, no, not your kind of stuff that you've taught about, like the Viet Cong using explosives and hit and run tactics. This is like a set piece, full on set piece battle, and the Viet Minh win, convincingly win. So this is a disaster for France. France therefore has to pull out, and so then what happens is there's a conference in Geneva which then decides, the Geneva Accords, that Vietnam will be split 50-50 across the parallel, as they always do. You right, mates? Yeah. In the north and the south there will be elections, and that will then come to a unified Vietnam. That's the plan. Okay, so that's the background. Now the American involvement. Then the Americans have already been involved financially because of supporting the French. They believe in the domino theory. All right, so they want to do everything they can do to support Vietnam. There's one big problem that they face. If there's going to be unified elections in Vietnam, who's going to win? Well, it's going to be Ho Chi Minh. It's going to be Ho Chi Minh is going to win. So we don't really want elections. So this, if you like, is the original sin of American involvement in Vietnam. They don't allow elections to take place. And what then happens is that North Vietnam and South Vietnam, supposedly temporarily, now become independent states. All right. In the north, it's a communist state led by Ho Chi Minh, and in the south, eventually after a power struggle, after a guy called Bo died, it's led by a guy called Diem. Kind of a dictatorship, really. Diem is as I mentioned before, is a French-speaking Catholic, represents the kind of urban elite of Vietnamese society. All right. But there's a problem. So, but the Americans start developing aid. So, let's go to what you need to do for your course. All right. When you talk about American involvement, we're going to see how that involvement escalates. So under Eisenhower, we have the support of financial support and growing number of advisors. So the Americans start sending military advisors to support and train up the South Vietnam Army, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVIN, as it becomes known. All right. For the Vietnamese, you have the Viet Minh in the North Vietnamese army, and so they start infiltrating and start supporting local southern people to rise up against the occupation. That becomes known as the Viet Cong, otherwise known as VC, Victor Charlie on radios, or Charlie in movies. All right. So the Viet Cong is established as a way to overthrow the southern government. Southern government of Diem is massively corrupt, massively unpopular. It is a Catholic, elite, urban movement. Then he also starts oppressing the vast majority of people who are Buddhists. There's a lot of Buddhist uprising, including the self-immolation of a Buddhist monk called Chuck Van Duch, I think.
He burnt himself.
Yeah, self-immolation, set himself on fire. All right. So Kennedy, and this is where we'll get into. We'll firstly probably get into U.S. involvement, because I said the most important assassination in 1963 is not going to be Kennedy's. The Americans have a problem with a dictator or a government that they don't like. Eisenhower's policies have been to do what with them? As we've seen in Congo, we saw in Iran, we saw in Guatemala.
Sort of like just beat them up, throw them into the ocean, hope they die.
Essentially, yes, assassinate them. So they come up with plans to assassinate Diem. All right, and this is where we're really going to get into it, because this is the pivotal moment of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Because up until they assassinate Diem, they've been at arm's length. You know, they've been involved. They've got advisors and things there, but they've kind of like been at arm's length in there. All right. Whereas the assassination of Diem, they don't personally carry it out. They know about it. The embassy knows about it. They sort of like go along with it as well. And this really marks a moment where, you know, if you break something, you have to fix it. All right, so they break it, so therefore they have to fix it. The problem is, as will become apparent, is actually relatively, compared to what comes after, Diem was actually pretty good, relatively. I mean, he was still like, you know, if he's a son of a bitch, as long as he's our son of a bitch. But compared to the people that followed, he wasn't. And this again is the original problem that the Americans will face in Vietnam. Is number one, Ho Chi Minh's by far and away the most popular person. And if there was an election, he would win, clearly. Number two, the government of South Vietnam is dysfunctional. It does not have popular support. It is massively corrupt. So they will give money for soldiers and so 20,000 people will like supposedly on the payroll, but only 10,000 people will come out fighting because they pretend there's 10 other thousand people there and put it in their pockets. So because of the corruption and dysfunctionality, this is the main reason why the United States loses in Vietnam. The government that they back, the government of South Vietnam, is unpopular, is corrupt, is dysfunctional. Whereas we compare that to the government of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh. Say what you like about communism and communists, they tend to be very good at organising. And North Vietnam is much more organised. It's also a key question. If you're in a war, people are going to have to give up their life. What are you going to die for? Are you going to die for a despotic, corrupt, thieving regime? Or are you going to die for your country's independence and for the idea of communism? Which are you most likely to do? Essentially, you're going to go for the side that you think is going to win. And if you don't know who's going to win, you're going to go to the side that has the ideals, rather than dying for a feudal, essentially kind of dictatorship. So, he is assassinated. The next thing is going to be how the United States then gets involved, because the United States is now involved. It's taken over as a military dictatorship. And the Americans really have to support what they have imposed. They now have responsibility for it. But hey, it's okay, because we've just run the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know what we're doing. We've just beaten the Russians, so we can easily beat. We can easily beat the Vietnamese. All right. So, how does the United States go from this at arm's length, albeit they are increasing their involvement in Vietnam, from financially to advisors on the ground? The number of American soldiers in Vietnam is increasing. How does it really get going? How does it really become a full-scale war? And that's where we need to talk about President Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin. Just 5 more minutes of this lesson. We'll do this tomorrow. All right. I just background on Johnson. All right. Lyndon Johnson is John F. Kennedy's vice president. John F. Kennedy doesn't trust Lyndon Johnson. He's there because Lyndon Johnson is very good at one thing. Lyndon Johnson was before he became vice president, and I think he's famous for this saying that the job of vice president isn't worth a bucket of warm wee. I think he said that. But anyway, President Johnson beforehand is the leader of the Senate Majority Leader, which means that he, as senator from Texas, is voted in by his colleagues to lead the majority party, the Democrats, in the Senate, which means that he is an expert at passing legislation. And in some ways, this is the idea that you get. You get the perfect combination. You get John F. Kennedy, who is the good-looking, charming face of the government, sets out all the ideas, speaks beautifully, does all the convincing, but it's Lyndon Johnson who does all the work. All right, it's Lyndon Johnson who does all the work. He's the one who gets legislation passed through. All right. This will become important because once, and also he comes from a pretty poor background. John F. Kennedy is as much royalty in America as you can get. His father's an ambassador, etc. Right, they're a very rich, wealthy family. So after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Lyndon Johnson becomes president. All right, so he has a great goal that he wants to be able to do. There's two goals he wants to be able to do. One is he wants to take advantage of John F. Kennedy's assassination, which means that his popularity is riding very high, and able to use that to pass legislation. This will be Kennedy's legacy. He will pass legislation. So this is why he introduces the Civil Rights Act, to ensure that black people within America have equal rights. get rid of old laws such as what we call the Jim Crow laws, end segregation and stuff like that. But he also, coming from his poor background, he has his own ideas of his own. His own ideas of his own? That's very articulate, this word. Right, he has his own ideas of things that he wants to do. Particularly, he wants to be seen as a new Roosevelt. Roosevelt introduced a New Deal, which revolutionized American government and gave lots of support to people when they were facing the Great Depression. He wants to do something similar, and he calls this his Great Society. And this is where he will introduce Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, widely more food stamps, social programs, and all of this. This Great Society programs. All right, he is Mr. Domestic Policy, and he will unveil the greatest and most significant expansion of the state and expansion of support for ordinary people in America's history. Domestically, he's a revolutionary president. This is what he wants to do with his Great Society. There's two issues with this that will become. One, that's going to cost a lot of money. Two, it means he's not interested in foreign affairs. He thinks things are more important. And this will be one of the main issues that the Americans will have in Vietnam. There is no one person who is responsible for Vietnam. This is nobody's priority. It is therefore something which develops ad hoc. It is something that develops without anybody leading it. There's nobody saying, well, I'm in charge, this is what we're trying to do. It just happens. Lyndon Johnson is concentrating on his Great Society programs. That's what he's thinking about, getting legislation done, civil rights. That's what he's thinking about. When he's trying to do this, that's his day job. Vietnam keeps coming up. He's like, "Grr, grr. Go away, I want to think about this. More money. No, I don't want to give you more money because I want money for social programs, not for Vietnam." Oh. And he's getting more and more torn and more frustrated. Robert McNamara and the Secretary of State for Defense and the Defense Department, yeah, they're doing Vietnam, they're fighting in Vietnam, but their number one is Russia. They're concentrating on the Cold War and they're concentrating on NATO. This is the big problem that the Americans will have. There is nobody in the White House who is full-time looking at Vietnam. There is no strategy. The whole thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis was you had XCOM, the big minds, the great minds in the White House, every day thinking, let's stroke our beards and let's think about what we can do to solve the Cuban Missile Crisis. It never happens in Vietnam. It's nothing like that. It's why US strategy in Vietnam gets taken away by events, by what happens on the ground, because there's nobody looking at it, there's nobody saying, what's our aim? How do we end this? What are we trying to do? What does success look like? So straight away, the United States effort in Vietnam is undermined by let's say three aspects. One, they're propping up, and they are supporting an unstable and unpopular dysfunctional government. Number two, there's no strategy. They make a series of ad hoc decisions to events as they go along. There's no strategy to it. Number three, they view it through a Cold War lens. This is communism, whereas it's as much a national liberation struggle as it is a communist struggle. And they are seen, because the Americans see themselves. There's a very good book called Our Man in Havana. No, not Man in Havana, that's also a very good book. Called The Quiet American, which is set in Southeast Asia. It's basically about Vietnam by Graham Greene. He's a very great British writer about this sort of like times in American policy and British foreign policy. The idea that this American goes there, and because the Americans were like the first to throw off their colonial oppressors, they're the first anti-colonists, they don't understand why other countries don't see them as colonialist, because why would we be? We know, we're not, of course we're not, but actually they carry out the same colonial policies as the British and French ever did, just far less effectively. So those are the three reasons. Dysfunctional government, no strategy, configuration of communism with nationalism. And we'll look at the key pivotal event that brings the Americans in tomorrow, which is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Alright? On that bombshell, any questions? Sorry, I whizzed on a lot today. Alright? Start catching things up.